everyone. My name is Caitlin Ryan, and I am on the board here at the Cannabis Alliance, as well as a member and chair of the Legislative Committee, and I'm coming to you live from Washington, D.C. This is one of those best laid plans situations where we were hoping to come to you today with a roundtable, but we're still going to be able to do that. We're just going to put it off until tomorrow. It's been a really busy day out here. We've had, my team has had 4 meetings, and Burrell is still finishing up his meetings, and he'll be able to join in the conversation hopefully in just a little bit here. But we will have a full wrap up for you tomorrow live, which is a little bit different from our normal time as has been this today. But I wanted to just check in and let you all know we've been talking about safe banking with a bunch of representatives as well as senators. You saw my earlier post with Senator Rand Paul. We had a great conversation with his staff, and looking at safe banking, in particular the SAFE Act, would allow for cannabis banks or cannabis businesses to do banking along with every other industry, and provide some protections. And so some of the stories that we've been sharing have been about not just the regulatory need to be able to do banking, but also in particular how in Washington state the lack of ability to deposit our money into banks and take in particular electronic transactions is really important. I am outside because I wanted to show you this great view of the Potomac River where we're about to have our reception here shortly. But of course, that also means that very important helicopters, as they come and go from the Capitol, are also in the background. So sorry about that. But we have been trying to impress upon everybody the information regarding, in particular, safety for the folks that are working in our retail stores, and how important it is to take cash out of our transactions as much as possible. And that message has been heard. I wanted to share with you also a lot of conversation and a lot of questions around hemp and regulated THC cannabis and what the differences are, and are there any challenges. And we talked about the bill that we just passed in Washington state regulating cannabinoids, and how that has been a challenge to find exactly the right mark, and how some assistance and clarity around this plant that is regulated in 2 very different ways, the same singular plant, depending on how much THC is in it, and with not a lot of regard or thought to what happens to that plant after it's been harvested, etc. So I will be back with a more panel, and I'll be recording some reactions of everybody from across the country that's here in Washington, D.C. today, lobbying for safe banking, and we'll be able to share those with you tomorrow. So look forward to checking in tomorrow. It's been a really wonderful day, and hope you're all doing well back in Washington state. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today to Webinar Wednesday. The Cannabis Alliance is dedicated to the advancement of a vital, ethical, equitable, and sustainable cannabis industry. My name is Caitlin Ryan. I am a board member and chair of the Legislative Committee, and I'll let you two introduce yourselves.
Burl Bryson. I'm the executive director of the Cannabis Alliance and current patient of something, I don't know what.
And my name is Jill Walker. I am the operations director here at the Cannabis Alliance.
And for the purposes of today's conversation, I am also going to dub you resident policy wonk of all things national politics. Thank you, Jill, for being here as our person who wasn't on the ground, but very much plugged into what is happening in Washington, D.C. to help us have the conversation. And I will maybe start with a little bit of an update of, in general, the federal policy that was talked about. And then I would like to kind of get into some of the actual direct meetings, Burl, that you and I had. Luckily for this conversation, we were on different teams. So we had different meetings, and maybe talk about some famous people sightings and all of that good stuff. But I think one of the most useful meetings I got to go to was with the Federal Cannabis Caucus. Representative Blumenauer out of Oregon hosts a cannabis caucus in Washington, of which several states are members. And come to find out, in a really frustrating turn of events, we do not have any Washington representation in the Cannabis Caucus in Washington, D.C., which I think is not right and a real big bummer. And so we'll sort of been taking on, I spoke to Blumenauer's legislative assistant and asked her, I was like, how do we get Washington folks involved in this? And she looked back at me and smiled. She goes, good question. How do you get Washington folks involved in the Cannabis Caucus? I went, okay, good to know. So we'll be working on getting some of our people. We were one of the first states to legalize, right along with Oregon on the exact same day. And so we should be deeply involved in that conversation. I will say, Patty Murray has co-sponsored safe banking in the Senate. So that is at least a step in the right direction. Sometimes we've even struggled to get our folks on sponsorship of some really important cannabis legislation. So that's a positive. But it'd be great if they were a part of the bigger conversation, because while safe banking is an emergency that needed to be passed yesterday, last year, 5 years ago, we do have some other really important federal legal opportunities here, other than we all know about comprehensive reform, but there's some other really important incremental changes that we can talk about. One of which, Joe Biden at the beginning of the year pardoned all nonviolent federal misdemeanors for cannabis related offenses. Here in Washington state, the Cannabis Alliance was the championing organization for also passing that same legislation about 7 years ago, along with Joe Nguyen. Right now there is some federal legislation called the HOPE Act up that allows for $2 million over 10 years to expedite the expungement of those nonviolent misdemeanors. And that can go to states that have already passed legislation. It's to help folks go through that federal process as well as at the state level. So here in Washington, unlike other states, we can't do automatic expungement. Representative Drew Hansen has been working on trying to figure out if for something like this, there is kind of a workaround. It's for a good reason. We can't, the state law is that no legal action can be taken against you without you being present in court for that to happen. And so that's to protect people for the most part. However, in this situation, it also has kind of thrown a little bit of a wrench into our ability to just automatically expunge those records. And since there is no sort of aggregate judicial record keeping here in Washington state, if you happen to have a misdemeanor, it may be a bit of a challenge to figure out what jurisdiction that's in, how to file that paperwork. There is a fee associated with filing that paperwork and sometimes supporting evidence that's required depending on the jurisdiction. Anyways, you can go on our YouTube channel and check out, we've got a couple of webinars helping people apprise themselves of that process, but we know that less than 1% of the population that is able to expunge their records has actually apprised themselves of that process. And so as we continue to help folks out, something like the HOPE Act with a little bit of funding to help with the administration of that would be really wonderful. And so we'll continue to stay plugged in on that. Something else that is very near and dear to our hearts, and that is veterans protections. There are 2 federal bills, one called the Veterans Equal Access bill, and then another, the Vet Safe Harbor Act. Both allow for protections for physicians at the VA to talk to veterans about the use of cannabis for both pain management as well as for PTSD management. Because of course, since it's federally illegal in these federal hospitals, that can have severe repercussions. We hear from vets all the time who have lost their benefits because it has gone on their record that they use cannabis. And if you have listened to veterans at all talk about their experience, that cannabis has been a life-saving medicine for a lot of folks, both with PTSD as well as pain management. And in particular, the Vet Safe Harbor Act has a fiscal note of $5 million to study how cannabis can help people reduce, if not end, their use of opiates and mitigate opioid addiction, which is not just a problem amongst our veteran population. It's a epidemic in our society. I had heard a statistic yesterday that everybody in the United States knows somebody who has or is currently in active opioid addiction. And that's staggering. That's staggering. Let's see, there was one other thing I was going to add to that thought. And then, of course, we were out there talking about safe banking, and as well as some reform around 280E, which is the tax code, that even though cannabis is federally illegal, we still have to pay taxes. Wasn't it? This is the Al Capone thing. This is how they got Al Capone. Or no, that was mail fraud. But along those lines, no, it was 280.
It was tax.
Or tax.
So 280E was actually set up in the 1980s as a tool to combat what was referred to as the cocaine cowboys. But it was done on the basis of, hey, this is how we got Al Capone, was for tax evasion. So we can go after, it's a tool to allow us to go after people that are trafficking in Schedule I narcotics. So 280E was set up specifically to not allow standard business deductions to be done against the cost of goods sold in operating a business that trafficked in Schedule I narcotics. And so because cannabis is scheduled as a Schedule I narcotic, along with heroin and methamphetamine, which means that there is no medically accepted use and as a highly dangerous drug. Both of those things patently untrue with cannabis, which gets us into another conversation. But yeah, that's how 280E started. It was to take on Pablo Escobar and the cocaine cowboys, and it's currently being put on every state legal cannabis operator in the nation.
Right, which, I know plenty of folks who, when they put their effective tax numbers out there, it's in the high 80s, low 90s, without being able to take those deductions. And then we look at here Washington State with the by far highest excise tax out of any other adult use state, and then also put on municipal taxes around 9, 10, 11, up to 13%. It gets rough to have a business. And especially as we're looking at these comprehensive reform discussions, and then 280E could go away, an additional federal tax, because of course everybody's going to want their cut. It becomes pretty onerous if you are not already a very large corporation to operate a cannabis business, which brings us to the other update that was a part of that conversation in the Cannabis Caucus, and that is around the 8-factor analysis that the FDA is doing about the scheduling of cannabis. Brill, do you mind talking a little bit more about that scheduling and where cannabis is situated, and what it would mean to deschedule it or reschedule it?
Yeah. So and I think you mentioned this, when President Biden in October of last year announced that he was going to offer pardons to federal convictions for cannabis possession, he also announced a reschedule, deschedule. So, or at least he announced, he signed a, sorry, my brain is not working that well today. I apologize in advance, but he signed an executive order requiring that the schedule of cannabis as a Schedule I narcotic gets reviewed. And so it's the opinion of those that have reviewed the criteria for a Schedule I narcotic that cannabis cannot survive a review of its schedule status as a Schedule I. And so there is anticipation that will change either by reschedule, meaning Schedule 2, 3, 4, 5, or deschedule, meaning off altogether. And as my old evidence professor always used to say, is there a third alternative? And there is a third alternative, and that is Schedule 6. And this is a proposed new schedule level that is just for cannabis, that takes into account cannabis's state legal nature and also its advantage to the states as a small business generator, because most of the cannabis businesses out there are small businesses that employ lots and lots of people. And so nobody in the current state legal system would like to see this get overrun by big pharma, big tobacco, big alcohol, any of these massive corporations with billions, literally war chests of billions and billions of dollars that are sitting on the sidelines waiting for something to happen so they can step in and take control of cannabis. And so Schedule 6 would potentially offer a way to continue to roll out on a small business basis and not throw the doors open to huge corporate actors.
Yeah. And Americans for Safe Access is sort of the federal group that is championing this idea. And I will get the link into our Facebook chat here so that folks can learn a little bit more about that if they want to. Right now, if you are so moved, the public comment is still open on this, on the 8 factors that the FDA is using to evaluate where cannabis sits. And really quickly, the factors are cannabis's actual or relative potential for abuse. We have already got some great data on that. Scientific evidence of the pharmacological effects in the general pharmacology of cannabis, which of course we all also know some really great information on that. That's where it starts to get a little bit nervous making about whether or not this is going to continue the way that adult use states have been, or if big pharma is going to be able to claw in all cannabis business here in the United States. Factor 3, the state of current scientific knowledge regarding the drug or other substance. Factor 4, its history and current pattern of abuse. 5, the scope, duration, and significance of abuse. 6, what, if any, risk there is to the public health. 7, its psychic or psychological dependence liability. And Factor 8, whether the substance is an immediate precursor of a substance already controlled. And I think that last Factor 8 is known as, is this a gateway drug?
Well, and that was what popped out to me, right? Is it's interesting how on the federal level there's still, and locally, right, there's still that conversation about cannabis being a gateway drug into other things. And the fact that it's popping up in that 8 factor, thing is really telling to me. And why, when we are talking about our legislators and our politicians, my swan song, especially on a national level, is that, and locally, to be honest, is that they need to hear from you over a variety of things, right? And with sourced facts and with ways to kind of go, this, and this is why, for example, cannabis is not a gateway drug. And being in that constant communication with your legislators is a really great way to make yourself a resource and to make resources that you use available to your legislators so that they can learn and educate themselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and that list is so fascinating, especially in the context of this conversation around, not that, cannabis has always been tagged as this gateway drug. And we have actually now some pretty good population research that it's not so much the cannabis itself that was the gateway drug, it was the illicit nature of cannabis. And that as you were getting your illicit cannabis, also then we're introduced to all of the other drugs that were available.
Well, and that information is there, right? Like if you look at that veterans bill that's talking about, putting out funding for research to talk about getting people off of opioids using cannabis, that there is obviously already that knowledge out there that cannabis is, I don't know what you call it, an anti-gateway drug.
Well, and that's what I was just going to say is that what we really know, and we have research, that it's an exit drug, right? It's not a gateway drug it's an exit drug for, in particular, very specifically opioids. And two of the gentlemen in my group, and I'll be able to get the name of the organization that they're with, they do research, and they have some proprietary software. Gosh, my brain is also not working so great. Software that is able to separate patient data from de-identify that patient data, so they can actually look at medical records of folks who are accessing dispensaries. And we're looking at folks who had been on long-term opiate prescriptions, and who then entered the retail stores. And so they had data across, I think, 7 or 8 different stores over a couple of years. And what they showed was that people who were using opiates and then started using cannabis, there was a 30% reduction in opiate use, which is extremely significant and impactful. And not only that, but we're able to leave opiates behind entirely in a lot of cases. And every time we said that statistic in an office, all 5 meetings, that was immediately a note right away, written down. And my group got to go to Katie Porter's office, which was fantastic. I'm a big fan of Katie Porter, particularly around her honesty and banking initiatives. And if you all have not checked out, maybe it was a good 4 years ago, but her interview of Jamie Dimon during testimony around banking practices and livable wages is beautiful for all people to watch. I highly
Well, and just to double down on that, there was
Yeah.
actually, and I'm not going to remember specifically what piece of legislation she was back in on, but there have been recently in like 2023 where her and her fabulous whiteboard have come up and just been like, these are the facts. And don't let them stop, right? There are really good ways to wiggle out of conversations and questions and kind of deflect. And she's just, I reclaim my time. Here's what I'm asking. Here are the facts. Do you agree? It doesn't let them waffle at all. Be like, no, reclaiming my time. This is the facts. Do you not know your facts? And so she is a really great example of a politician who is trying to get real answers for a situation, and come up with real solutions.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and in her office, right when we walked in, it wasn't a whiteboard, but it was one of those large poster boards that they put up on the easel, and it was rates of opiate addiction and fentanyl deaths here in the United States. And conversation aside, but the graph is chilling, and it is not going down at all. And particularly fentanyl is a terrifying situation, I think, for anybody who has kids at all. Well, I guess anybody who knows a human, fentanyl is terrifying. And so when we had that conversation about cannabis as a potential exit drug, that was a good solid conversation there. And yeah, like the Vet Safe Harbor Act would be wonderful if we could really get some solid research out there behind what practitioners already know. Every practitioner I know that's a physician that is working in pain management already knows that that cannabis helps relieve people of opioid addiction. And our own John Kingsbury, and our patient, not that he was has had pain management issues his entire life, and he has a really powerful visual aid where he pulled out 2 1-gallon baggies of prescription bottles and said, this is what I was prescribed every month for pain management, and I take none of these anymore because cannabis does the job, which is tremendous and powerful.
It's pretty phenomenal. Opioids are not a good long-term pain manager. You have to use more and more of them to affect your pain over time, so people become increasingly addicted to them. Whereas cannabis over the long term is a far better manager of pain and helps people get off opioids. And I think that's the critical thing. In fact, I just dropped in the chat there an article from the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, excuse me, which addresses this specific issue, and again shows that cannabis helps opioid addicts get off of their opioid medication and utilize cannabis for their long-term pain relief. It's such a huge impact, especially when we're facing this massive opioid epidemic and fentanyl crisis in this country, that simply cannabis is the answer to it for the majority of people. Is phenomenal.
Yeah. And I want to clarify some terms here because we're using the word addict pretty freely, and want to be really clear, just because of the stigma that that word brings along with it. If we're looking at that 8-factor analysis, right, where addiction comes up, and I think 7 of the 8, we're talking opiates are a physical addiction. So what happens is it takes over receptors in your brain so that it can stop the pain from moving around. But since it takes it over, your body stops doing it for itself. And that's what we are talking about by addiction. There is no moral failing at all whatsoever. And most people who find themselves in this problem are here because a doctor prescribed it first. And there was not, and there is not, and doctors struggle with this too. There is not really an effective way other than weaning off, which can be very painful as well, and difficult. And there is not a good exit ramp when people receive them following a surgery or an injury. And like Beryl said, because the body stops doing its job on its own, relying on these opiates, you have to start taking more and more. And then that's how people find themselves in a really difficult spot. And ultimately the end result is always death. And so that's why this gets really scary. And then fentanyl enters because it's really, really strong, but because of its strength, is unmanageable and readily available out and about in the illicitly. And then that's how people overdose.
And
Anybody want to add
overdose,
to that
there's
summary?
a couple of really interesting points there. One is that overdose on an opiate causes a depression in your respiratory system that slows your breathing and heart rate until you die. And so overuse of fentanyl, it's very easy to result in death just because of a suppression of your respiratory system. And the thing about cannabis is that cannabis is not replacing a natural body chemical. Your body has something called your endocannabinoid system, similar to your lymphatic system, which regulates overall your immune system. And your CB1 and CB2 receptors in your brain are only set up to receive cannabinoids. Your body doesn't produce any natural substances. So cannabis, as a result, is not physically addictive. And that comes as a shock to a lot of people because they hear about cannabis addiction all the time, and it's not a thing. So in the science, they talk about cannabis use disorder. And cannabis use disorder is defined differently in that you're using cannabis on a regular basis and you're finding that cannabis is interfering with your job or relationships or other things, your enjoyment of life, and you're finding it difficult to stop using cannabis. And so that's an emotional addiction versus a physical addiction. And so I think that's a really important differential designation.
It's a really great, important distinction, and one that I think needs to be given the space that it deserves as well, right? Just because it is not necessarily physically addictive, there are people that have a hard time, and I think that we don't do ourselves any favors by hiding that, first off. And secondly, wouldn't it be cool if we could acknowledge it and then figure out a way to help with those things, right? And if figure out, as with a lot of addictions like opiates or things like that, what in your life is missing that you are using your substance, for example, to help mitigate, and the therapy that goes along with it. And I think that that's a piece that we don't really talk about very much, and that is a hard conversation to have, but it's one that I think that we need to have. And as we start looking towards federal legalization and start bringing in more of the knee-jerk anti folks that are on the national level, it's a conversation that we don't help ourselves by hiding behind. And I think that it's one that, in general, cannabis, as we all know, is a miracle. It can change this world. Cannabis and hemp can change the world, right? But we need to be having conversations across the board about what it's good for and what research we still need to do.
Unfortunately, the prohibition in cannabis over the last 100 years has also been a prohibition on research. And it continues to this day. It's super difficult
Absolutely.
for any federally funded educational institutions, which most of our state schools are, to engage in cannabis research because they can't touch the plant because of federal funding to the institution. So,
Or if they can touch the plant, it's something that's so far removed because it's from one specific place, from one specific thing, that is in no way the same level of cannabis that we have in our available markets right now.
and that's talking about the NIDA monopoly. So NIDA is the National Institute for Drug Awareness. And so the University of Mississippi, I think since the 1960s, has been awarded a monopoly to produce cannabis for any federally funded study or federally legal study on cannabis. And their job since the 60s, they're awarded $1 million every year to grow the worst possible cannabis that they can. And so they throw seeds in dirt and outdoors, and then when the straggly plant is grown, they cut leaves, stalks, and stems, grind everything up, and pre-roll it into joints and irradiate it. And that's what gets distributed to researchers if they want to research any kind of cannabis issue where their patients get cannabis. Or for those, I think 6 patients left nationally that have prescriptions for glaucoma, they get their cannabis from there as well. And that cannabis gets sold to those patients or to those researchers at $30 a gram. So they get paid $1 million to produce it, and then they sell it for $30 a gram, which is a great deal. I'd like that as well. When we had our summit last year, we talked to Dr. Sue Sisley, who had one of the very first few federally funded studies to study treatment-resistant PTSD in veterans, because she's very involved with veterans issues and recognized that 22 a day is 22 too many. And she got her, after 8 years, got her study funded, but had a very difficult time with the VA and getting veterans to participate because she couldn't advertise her study. So after that incredibly challenging experience, she went out and got one of the first DEA licenses to grow cannabis for research. So she's got a DEA research license, which allows her to actually grow cannabis. She's got the only DEA research license in the nation that's actually producing cannabis for research studies. And she's obviously a phenomenal individual, and this is pretty cool, but it's an opportunity actually to do now real research on cannabis without NIDA weed. So sorry, that was a little soapbox. I had to climb up there for a second.
No, I think it's really great content and a really good reminder for folks when we start to have these conversations. You know, it's one of the things that I find the most exciting about with federal legalization. And I mean, obviously, you know, people not going to prison anymore and being able to really set up a cohesive national market, I think is amazing. But I think that there is so much potential left in this plant and so many things that even we just don't know, you know. And if we could really get some good federally funded research doing, you know, not just prevention oriented research, I think that there could be, you know, we could find some solutions to things that we can't even imagine right now. But you have to do it, and you have to do it with the best, right? You can't have your stems and stalks and dirt weed being what you try to research to attempt to cure cancer, for example. You know, it's so I think that that's one of the most exciting parts about federalization, at least to Jill as a human, right? And giving us an opportunity here in Washington to really be on the forefront of what some of that research looks like once those federal walls fall.
Yeah, well, and this conversation is a great illustration of why it was so difficult to find a moment to hop online while we were out there, because we got to have exactly these kinds of conversations with other advocates from across the country. And I'm kind of curious, Burl, if what of the standout conversations that you had, whether it was in a legislator's office or with the other attendees that were there for lobby days, what were 1 or 2 of your most standout conversations?
Wow, put me on a spot right now when my brain's broken.
I know, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
If you want to think about it for a second.
I think the Schedule 6 conversation was one that really stuck out to me. And for folks that want to look it up, it's schedule6.org, which is really simple to look up, and it goes through it. I wasn't aware of it until I went to Washington to have that discussion. And one of the guys in my group was a chemical engineer, and he brought it up. He had a copy of it and started talking about it. I was like, what is this and what's it about? So I subsequently started doing research on it, went on the website and read the information, and it totally makes sense. It's a way, it's a way to allow for getting rid of 280E and also protecting the small business nature of cannabis and the way it has grassroots grown up in our communities as a small business that's providing jobs and incentives at that level. I call it trickle up economics, and because it's really providing good paying jobs, health insurance, all of the other good things around that, and money into local economies rather than siphoning money out of local economies into large corporations. And so that, for me, that was one of the most exciting discussions that I had. Give me a second and I'll think about another. You tell a story and then I'll see if I can hand crank my mind into working.
Yeah, sure. Well, and honestly, I would say what I really appreciated, not one specifically, but the research organizations, Jill, we had talked about, the lack of research that's out there, and it tended to be more on the economic side of things, but folks just taking the need for information into their own hands and saying, hey, we have to stop having these conversations in a vacuum of data. And folks like Bo Whitney and BDSA and the other gentleman, and I am so sorry, I am also blanking on who they are, and I will make sure that I get that information, but who did this opioid addiction research, and just then you start talking to these folks who are doing this data collection and research, and you kind of go, oh my gosh, well, what about this? And what about that? And what about? And when you really start thinking, gosh, all of the things I would love to know and have actual data behind. And I'm appreciative that our market is asking for those things. And so these are mostly privately funded studies, but at this federal level, again, like that Safe Harbor Act, how great it would be for some actual federal resources to be put towards this research, and like bringing up Sue Sicily, who has the grow license there. I think there's another 8 or 9 that have been handed out, but they are primarily being held as a license of value in and of themselves, not necessarily for growing to a research project, which is really extremely frustrating. And that, with the power of government resources behind some of this research that could really help us make better policy, I think that was one of the really striking conversations to me.
Interesting. So that brings up a question for me, because we do a local lobbying event here every year through the Cannabis Alliance, where we kind of hit the hill and have our conversations with our local representatives. But what do you think your biggest takeaways in the difference between those two? I would assume that it would really help fill the tank up when you're able to come together with people from all over the country that have similar ideas and be able to have that melting pot of what's happening there and happening in other places. Did you get a chance to have those conversations? Do you feel like that was something that was beneficial?
I don't know about you, Burl, and I wish I had better news here. Let me sandwich it. First, I will say, to the one, every single person that I met and talked to was extraordinary and lovely and had the power of the plant at the heart of the work that they were doing. And I deeply appreciated that. Nobody's having a good time right now. No matter what state you're in, everybody is struggling, and they're struggling more, and they're feeling more disheartened as this continues to go on. We talked with folks in New York who are in the midst of that struggle. That is tremendous, comparing our state to other states and in the ways that we are restricted sort of I think unfairly, and that other states don't have to contend with. Got a lot of sympathy for what Washington's going through, but then, again, talking to another state that is still just barely coming online and going, "Ooh, I'm glad we're not there anymore," at least. So it's yeah, we have adult use in a lot of states and medical in nearly all of them. It is still really, really, really hard. We actually, to hear, a gentleman who was at one of our pandemic summits, all online, who talked about equity. That was 2 years ago. And he said he was going to be finally opening his store this week. So
Oh.
2 years after we talked to him, he was finally getting his store operational and was really excited about that. And I kind of hang on to that, and want to honor the tenacity of everybody that is a part of this movement, that while we are still federally illegal, and even I would say at the state level, although we have adult use, prohibition is still in full effect. And everybody keeps trying, and that's from a passion and community, and that was really heartening. I started rambling there. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You absolutely did. Well, and it brings up a really unique point that, like, and why federalization, why these conversations are so important now, right? There's such a patchwork happening in all the different states, and we're all in very different places, and we all have very different, unique restrictions that are not conducive to the other states. And so, when we start having these conversations about federalization and how we kind of streamline things a little bit once we do get to that point, I find it really interesting what different states are doing that they're doing right, and what different states, in the "what about the children" conversation, or the "we can't do this because it's going to be scary to people" conversation, what different states took in that respect that the other states didn't, and where those problems have come from, right? And that, we talk a lot here in Washington about how we were first, and, it's taken us 10 years plus to get to where we are now, and it's still not perfect. But we're 10 years ahead of states like New York, right? And we're 10 years ahead of some of these other states, and even, California, which has got its own slew of problems. And so it's sometimes nice to go back and reflect and be like, we've got some problems, but we're doing okay.
Well, one of the opportunities we had was to be a bit of a canary in the coal mine to states like New York. So some of the conversations that I had with representatives there, and my understanding right now is there's only been 6 retail licenses and their equity licenses. And New York, the one I think good thing that they're doing is they're operating from an equity first standpoint, and they're awarding those equity licenses before throwing the door open to the Gen Pop. But of those 6 licenses of an estimated 3,000 retail locations that are operating in the state right now. So one of the conversations that we were able to have was, we're having a tremendous problem in Washington state with retail cannabis robberies and violent robberies. And this is something that's coming to you if it's not there already. This is coming to every legal state until we pass safe banking. And so the SAFE Act, which is primarily what we were there to talk about, is really safety, not only for cannabis businesses to have the ability to bank, but critically to go to cashless transactions. And people don't really understand, like, what's the issue. And the issue is that everybody knows that cannabis retail contains a lot of cash and also no guns. And so that seems like an easy target. And so this conversation that we were able to have, looking forward to other states that were coming online right now, was, hey, we're having a massive problem in this state right now, and this is coming to a state near you soon. If you're having adult use legal cannabis, what you're going to see is more and more of this. And I think it's probably happening in New York, but with the gray market retail locations that they have there, probably a lot of that is not getting reported because there's nowhere for those people to go. It's like, oh, well, you're operating an illegal business, therefore, you can't go to the cops. And that's, traditionally the way it's been in cannabis forever. If somebody robbed you of your cannabis, even if it was medicinal, there's very little opportunity for redress to law enforcement.
Yeah, and stopthedrugwar.org has put together a really great study that is based on the data that was collected here in Washington State, particularly in 2021, where our numbers of armed robberies were sky high, reaching crisis level, to help underline that particular piece of things, that, while safe banking is really important for business operation, and the conversation we had previously had more to do with things like allowing access to lending, things like that would be great for owners, that not having safe banking is actually a public health problem and a public safety problem and a worker safety issue. And here in Washington State, unfortunately, we are the example of how bad that can actually go. And so we are working now also on a letter here soon to get out and support safe banking. And at this point, it's looking pretty decent in the Senate. When I met with Rand Paul's office, there was a few markup issues that they had to do, but everybody's expecting it to pass the Senate, which would be the first time it's passed the Senate. It's passed the House several times. So the idea here is, if it passes the Senate, that we shouldn't have a problem in the House, and we might actually get this legislation done this year. We were really hopeful last year, but this year hopefully will be the year.
One of the most interesting things that I learned as well, and part of this is, we kind of complain in our state about how slowly the wheels turn, and it takes us sometimes 2 or 3 years to get our legislation to the point that it can get passed. And when I got there, I was like, oh yeah, the SAFE Act has passed the House 9 times. 9 years they've been trying to get this Safe Banking Act. And their response was, that's standard. Like, it takes 10 years to get anything done in Congress.
Well, according to Al, who says common understanding is it takes 5 to 10 years to get a bill passed on average at the state level, and 20 to 30 years at the federal level, assuming there's not some emergent reason that something needs to get done. But if you're just trying to pass good policy, that is somebody's lifetime work in Washington.
I was going to say, that's an entire adult human worth of, working for a specific issue, which I guess makes it seem actually kind of nice that it's only taken us a decade to get this conversation going somewhere.
We're moving at light speed. Like, what are we complaining about?
Because we should never have been in this situation in the first place. Thank you so much, the generation previously that decided racism and cannabis belong together, and we're here. That is the statement of Caitlin Ryan alone as an individual.
So I want to take a couple of minutes.
That he would agree.
Yeah. Jill as a human agrees with you. I want to take a couple of minutes and kind of circle back to, how do we get our national Washington folk involved in this cannabis caucus? I think we kind of talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but there is zero reason that we should not have our local politicians on a national level helping support our cannabis businesses. It is something that our state people voted for, and it is something that our state, both in revenue in terms of businesses and in terms of, the consumer base, are currently suffering from things that could be easily changed on the federal level. So how do we get our local politicians involved?
Yeah, well, and let's just say what a caucus is. It's not even actually supporting cannabis businesses. A caucus is truly just an information exchange. It's just for legislators who might have an interest in knowing what is going on regarding cannabis policy in Washington, D.C., which, to your point, all of our Washington state legislators should at least have a small appetite to know a little bit about what is happening in cannabis policy. And the meeting was short. It was extremely informative. What's lovely about Washington, D.C. is if it can't be said in 2 sentences, people don't say it. So you get a lot of good information super fast. Yeah, right. look up who your representative is and send their staff an email. You can just Google what is my federal legislative district, and we can get a link in here to that.
I was gonna say, I can even do you one better. My favorite page on the Ledge website for Washington State, and I will drop it into the chat, is our app.ledge.wa/district finder. It works.
You're going to want to go to a different one because we're looking for a federal district.
Yeah. But I just looked it up and it does work the same.
It does federal district too?
It does federal district too. Which is super cool. All you have to do is type in your address and it'll tell you who your local national representatives are. Now, personally, I know who my personal representative is, and I like to send her information on, whether it's cannabis or the school systems, or thanking her for coming out in support of a certain issue. It's something I like to add into my Saturday morning coffee run. I understand that it's not what everybody likes to do, but for this one in particular, and with safe banking, and to be part of this cannabis caucus, I think it is worth it to everyone to take the few minutes and make it work. Yeah, they're not going to do it if they don't hear from us. And as much as we get the joke that we are the other Washington, we have representation there, and we were the first state to legalize, and we are going through a lot of stuff, and it's high time that they get involved. And we've got some pretty smart minds here in Washington on the national level, so people that could champion it real easy.
Yeah, agreed. And it is some caucuses have dues and publish their list, and the dues are to cover the costs of educational speakers to come in to do that education, but this one is free. There's no dues, and it is anonymous. So from some of our Republican friends, maybe, who might have some concerns about showing up there, do know that this is a bipartisan issue, and so you should not feel afraid. And it can also be anonymous. And what you will want to tell them if you are reaching out to your representatives is that have their staff get in contact with Blumenauer staff in Oregon, which is really close by, and they'll be included in those quarterly meetings. And again, this is a great way to keep apprised of what cannabis policy is doing in Washington, D.C. We have about reached our hour. Any final thoughts?
One of a multiple of fascinating conversations that I had was with a gentleman named David Borden, and he is one of the driving forces behind StopTheDrugWar.org. Highly recommend people check out StopTheDrugWar.org. Great articles, great group. I've been fascinated by some of the stuff that I'm reading in there, so highly recommend to check out StopTheDrugWar.org.
And that is in the chat.
Awesome. All right.
I guess my final thoughts are just thank you both for coming and helping represent Washington cannabis. There is lobbying, whether it is on the local level or the national level, is something that is really important, and is something that a lot of the times get left to the big boys. And at the end of the day, the people are the power. And the more that you are willing to engage with your representatives, the more you are willing to say, as a constituent, this is what I think, the better political world we can have. And so it is real important. And I thank you both for taking the time out of our very busy schedule to spend a week in the other Washington to do that. And I encourage everybody else that, if you've got any kind of itch to get involved, it's a really low pressure way to kind of start that conversation and get involved. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, it's really, I don't know. It's really enlightening to go and participate in our nation's legislative process. And for me in particular, it was a real, fantastic event. I'd been there, I think I told you once before, in 2015, right at the very beginning of more state legal cannabis. But how far we've come since that time is phenomenal, and due to the hard work of thousands of individuals who've just rolled up their sleeves and said, this is wrong, we're going to fix it. And if you haven't ever had an opportunity to go to DC, please, next year, think about going, participating in lobby days, checking out the Capitol itself, which is a completely fascinating place, and participate in your legislative process. It's a great thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jill, to add one last thought on your question about what's different between the state and the federal level. And the reality is it's pretty much the same, just more spread out, more walking, more buildings. And other than that, it takes the intimidation factor way down to shrink it a bit and say, oh no, actually this is the same. And they need our information. There are not a lot of folks out there giving them information about cannabis, and sometimes their questions are still really rudimentary, so they're appreciative to hear what we have to say. And that's true of us in this very organized way. Or if you are talking to your representative, you can contact them at any time, and like Jill said, as often as you want, in fact.
Well, and sometimes I think people think that the national representatives have a lot more going on than the local, but especially if you're here inside the city of Seattle, your national representative probably has 30,000 people that elect 40,000 people that elect them. So, they want to hear from you, and then they're supposed to take what their constituents want and use that to enact national policy.
Yeah.
So
and they have a whole staff of really bright, idealistic folks who are there to push issues, and that those staff members really, really, really want to hear from you, because it helps them do their job better and get stuff done.
It's probably a percentage point of 1% of the electors in that district that actually register their opinions on stuff. And so those opinions become more powerful. Those staffers will collate the amount of calls and emails that they're getting on a specific issue, and the report will be generated for that representative. And it's phenomenal. You may get, of those 40,000 people, you may get 40 that call in on it or write in on a specific issue, and those are counted, and they say, well, my constituents, 30 of the 40 of them said that they would prefer this. Like, oh my God, what a tiny percentage, but that can move legislators to change their position one way or the other. So that, your idea of communicating on a regular basis with your legislator is absolutely, like, every one of us should be doing. You need to do that because your opinion matters. We organize these things all the time, Caitlin in particular, like, make it easy for you. Here's, go find your legislator, let them know, what your opinion is on this issue, because it matters. And so I really encourage everybody to participate in the process.
Well, participate in the process and encourage those around you to participate in the process, right? Back to those, let's call it 40,000, that 40,000 number. How many customers do you have coming through your store on a daily basis? What percentage of them want to make sure that their favorite bud tender isn't getting robbed because they have cash? How many, I have people in my family who are not cannabis folk, and they hear it, right? They want to be able to go and occasionally purchase cannabis in a place that they find safe, and safe banking is the easiest solution to that. You tell the normies, right, that we're an all cash business and we're not allowed to, all these rules that we're not allowed to do, and they're just like, yeah, I always wondered why I couldn't just use my Visa. I didn't realize that it was the federal government telling me I had to use cash, right? So it's that education, and then that quick, easy touch. Hey, I would like my favorite bud tender, Courtney, is scared to come to work, and that's not okay. Please pass safe banking. It's that easy. Multiply that by all the people in your life that care, and I mean that's a big number really quick. That comes up to that 40 number really, really quick, right? So you do matter, and your voice matters, and your opinion matters, and on a national scale, it can make a really big difference.
Yeah.
Yes, very much so. And I also want to let people know that we're planning on running a retail security bill in the next legislative session. So if you want to participate in that conversation, and I'd be remiss, this being membership May, in not saying so, take the opportunity to join the Alliance and participate in the conversation. If you want your voice heard, this is a great place to have your voice heard. And so if you want to talk about how best we can protect our retail cannabis stores, please join the Alliance and get involved in that conversation. Help us craft that legislation for the next legislative session.
Absolutely, which I did just drop our website into the chat, as well as we are all very, very available. There is a contact form on our website if you don't want to email us directly. And we'd love to hear you and your thoughts on all of this. So
Thank you both. Thank you, Burl, especially not feeling well. Really value your contribution to this conversation. And Jill, thank you as well for participating, and look forward to more of these conversations here at the Cannabis Alliance. We are dedicated to the advancement of a vital, ethical, equitable, and sustainable cannabis industry here, mostly in Washington State, but also federally in Washington, D.C. most recently. Yes. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Caitlin.